Hello everybody and welcome to this year's first Breaking Barriers Talks 2 video. We're in March already and this is the first time we've been able to do that this year. The month's really are flying by, and the last 4 weeks especially, not least because last month we were able to welcome our newest member to the team, and well, I've thrown her straight into the deep end really, and she's come to talk to me about a topic that she's really passionate about. Last week, Anushka, you presented to our senior leadership team on this topic, and I was really lucky to be able to attend that. I thought it was absolutely outstanding and really interesting. So wanted to give you this platform to talk a little bit more about it. You know it inside out far better than I do, so I won't talk for too much longer and really just want to sort of give you the space to bring that idea to the fore. So in brief, just sort of to kick off really, tell us about that topic that you did cover in that presentation.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, George. So I covered racial and ethnic disparities across women's sexual and reproductive health. And I've always been interested in kind of women's health, probably largely from my own experiences. And, you know, it's a topic that's only really been talked about and understood in probably the last 50 to 100 years, if anything. And, you know, more recently, sexual and reproductive health, that's still an issue that isn't really talked about so openly, and has only really been given the opportunity to be researched properly in the last, I think, 20 years. So that's why I was so drawn to doing that topic, just from my own experiences and from what I can see in policy at the moment. And I guess the way to kind of define sexual reproductive health is kind of a few moving parts. So, you know, having good physical, mental and social well-being, as well as having the ability to have safe and satisfying sex and the capability to reproduce. And the thing which really underpins it all is kind of having that freedom to choose when to do it and where to do it and how you'd like to do it. And, you know, that's what makes it a freedom and that's what makes it a liberty. It's about having that autonomy over yourself and your body and ensuring others respect that autonomy too. And in terms of racial and ethnic disparities, well, from my own experiences, I can see there's a lack of kind of knowledge in sexual and reproductive health, but I felt as though those experiences from women in Black and Asian communities were much more different from women in white communities, and that was driven largely by my own experiences. But then, you know, as I was researching more and more into it, I realized these are experiences that are shared on the national level, not just from myself. And something which deserves to be kind of captured as well. So yeah, that's why I decided to do it, and that's just a little overview of what it really is.
Yeah, I mean that's you know, when you're sort of drawing on research from your own experiences, I think it's always worth a note to just sort of say how kind of grateful I suppose we are that you have that candor and have that ability to share. I know it's, you know, it's not always easy to do that. I thought your presentation earlier this week was particularly timely as well. We had International Women's Day, but you're talking about quite seriously ingrained inequality in sexual and reproductive health. Now, that doesn't need a day, that doesn't need a week. There are clearly, what I'm hearing, longer term causes to this. Do you want to kind of explain what they could be a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I would say there are about 3 longer term causes, and I don't think they are confined solely to Black and Asian women's experiences in sexual and reproductive health. I think they're shared in other kind of problems in health and problems in general. And I think the biggest kind of driver is those historical and social norms which have been carried by, you know, our colonial and historical legacies, the implicit bias in services, the implicit biases in research. They're driven by these strange epistemologies of knowledge which are not current and which are not up to date. And they drive our attitudes and they drive our behaviors. And in relation to kind of, you know, sexual and reproductive health, some of the norms I kind of discovered in my research and which I've actually heard in my day-to-day life is, you know, the idea that Black skin goes deeper than white skin, the idea that Black and Asian people are fundamentally different to white people, and so are their bodies. which is, you know, obviously something which was carried in the slavery era and the colonial era, and unfortunately still clouds our kind of biases today. And you know, that fact is so interesting. Well, not fact, that perception is so interesting because, you know, I found one statistic which said there was 85% of genetic variation within ethnic and racial groups, and that there was 15% of genetic diversity between them. So if anything, we're more different within our groups than we are between each other. But, you know, those are the norms. And I think another kind of norm that I've heard and felt is the idea that Asian women are less intelligent, and that they're, you know, if these women do come up with kind of issues and they explain them to kind of service providers, perhaps they feel that sense of invalidation in their experiences and lack of confidence in their own kind of beliefs and thoughts. And you know, another issue which I think is felt is the idea that reproductive issues are self-inflicted, that they're our fault, that, you know, we're drug users, substance users, things like that. So, you know, that was really interesting. And I think so you've got that kind of historical and social bias, and that's also linked to another issue, which is the exclusivity of research. You know, who drives the agenda, who drives policy? In the UK, it's largely driven by white men, it's largely funded by white men, and it's largely delivered by white men. And this is so crucial because it tends to mean that women's priorities are lower down on the ladder, let alone women from these ethnic minority groups. And, you know, they train the next generation of researchers. So this becomes an awful cycle that just continues because it's been carried down for so long. And another interesting thing is, you know, the white body is taken as the norm. I saw recently, a few months ago, this illustration of a Black pregnant body in a textbook. And everyone was so shocked by that because they had never seen that before. And it's true, you know, when I looked into my science textbooks, it's only white bodies. You know, I don't think I've ever seen an image of an Indian pregnant woman. And you know, that drives those social perceptions, that drives those norms. And then the last thing I would say is kind of the stigma of sexual and reproductive health as it is, you know, and that's felt, I think, across all races, all ethnicities in the UK. There's a sense of embarrassment and shame, and you know, it feels like an awkward subject. And I think specifically to kind of, you know, Black and Asian communities, there are strong cultural and religious underpinnings, which kind of drive that even more. And it creates a space of a lack of openness and one of fear sometimes. And these communities can often be important support networks when you're going through these issues, and also important networks for knowledge. So to have them deprived and less accessible, it makes these issues even worse. So those would be the main three, I think.
I mean, yeah, that was really, really comprehensive. And, you know, what struck me is when we're talking about gender-based inequality, it's half the population, 50, 51%, whatever it is. What are the government doing, do you think, to tackle this? You know, do they have a strategy? Where is it?
Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, I think these issues have only really been come to light and shone on in the last 20, 30 years, to be honest. I think a lot of it was driven largely by the women's movement, the women's liberation movement, you know, that openness in respecting your body and, you know, putting that on the government's agenda and, you know, getting rid of sexism and things like that. And that's been a long-term movement, and it's still a movement now, and it's one which takes slow but long and hard progression. But really, I think something which has given that light to women of colour's problems is the Black Lives Matter movement, is the decolonized movement. These movements have been so important in showing the disparities within these groups themselves. You know, Black men and Black women don't experience the same issues. White women and Black women don't experience the same issues. You know, it's important to have that intersectional lens that recognizes all these kind of identity markers that lead to these unique levels of disadvantage and suppression. So I think the combination of these movements have been important in kind of pressurizing government to do something about it. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of information on it, but there were 2 reports which really caught my eye. And one was the Women's Health Strategy and Diversity Report. And what they found was, from 100,000 responses, was that 80% of women did not feel listened to by healthcare professionals. That's a very big statistic. And, you know, I bet it's even more, you know.
And that report, I think I know that report. That report was 100,000 people.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a pretty big sample size here.
Exactly. And, you know, women felt as though services relating to their issues were of a lower priority. And then there was another report which focused on minority ethnic groups as issues. And although that wasn't linked to a woman specifically, there were still some important insights. Lack of high quality ethnic monitoring of data, especially on cesarean data, which is so important, as I said before, because that's the issue which tends to affect women of colour more. The lack of trust, insensitive behaviour, inability to bridge these cultural differences, and a desire for stronger diversity to kind of increase that trust in the system. You know, you lead by example, but if you don't have examples, it's very difficult. And another important one, which I think is quite a recent development, is that immigrant women are not able to navigate these services so much as white women and understand the healthcare available.
And is that a language issue? Is that a cultural issue? Because that's a really interesting development, and I think, you know, particularly pertinent to what's happening over in Europe at the moment, but also other areas of the world, of course. You know, if we could almost begin to prepare for that, why do you feel some immigrant women particularly struggle to grapple with that system, do you think?
I think, you know, we've had a lot of crises with migration in the past 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. And a lot of them, you know, a lot of them do have family here, but a lot of them don't. They come from a very different part of the world where they had those kind of long-term historical communities there. And I think there's been a lot of hostility to immigration and migration. Certainly that makes it even harder. You know, I think these immigrant women, a lot of them do speak English, but a lot of them don't. And that in collaboration with the fact that there are lots of hostile policies being thrown at them makes it even worse in their kind of, you know, worse to access those services. They don't have the support because these policies don't reflect that support. That makes sense. So I think it's language barriers, and I think it's cultural differences, and I don't think the government is doing enough to kind of bridge those cultural differences. And I think that's driven a lot by kind of populist sentiment in the country at the moment.
That's interesting. What I'm kind of hearing, and tell me if I've not, because you know this, tell me if I've not got this right. So you're talking about this movement that has it has a long-term history, but relatively to the sort of history of humanity, it's extremely recent. So you cited the women's liberation movement, for example. That's happened in the lifetime of, you know, most people who are alive today. The BLM and the decolonized movement, that's certainly happened in our lifetime. But we're still talking about 80% of women not feeling listened to by health professionals. And that could be a data deficit, that could be a problem with the lack of diversity in research, that could be a language and or a cultural problem. But there was one word in particular that you mentioned before, and that was the intersectionality of it all. And I'm really interested, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, because there's no right or wrong answer. But of all of those things that I've said, and I'm sure there are more that I've unintentionally excluded, but what do you think the problem is? If you kind of had a magic wand, if you like, and you were to say, I think this is the biggest challenge affecting sort of gender-based inequality, what would you say it is?
Oh, that's so difficult, because obviously you know, these are all problems that need to be solved together in collaboration. If one's not working, it will impact it all. You know, these are different parts of the pie or whatever. But I think, you know, what I would say, which is a very vague answer, is culture. Culture is so important. It's this implicit bias, it's this patriarchy, and it's, you know, this this white bias. And that's why the women's movement has been so important, but that's why it's so slow, because cultural norms and cultural perceptions can't be changed overnight. They take generations. You can't just tell someone who is racist certain facts and truths. It's very difficult. Culture is a very slow process, but it's also one that needs to, be pushed generation after generation after generation. It's slow and it's heavy, but it's the main solution.
You talk about the cultural process being possibly an evolution and a quite a slow evolution rather than an instant revolution. But one of the purposes of government policy, you could argue, is to help shape that kind of social and cultural space as much as the economic space, which, I mean, we've not even got into that, but I'm sure that's for another issue. If you had the ear of government and you were to look at maybe a policy or a strategic approach, what would you want to see from them in, say, the next 5 years?
It's, it's quite difficult, especially for the UK. I think we are quite a racially diverse Western country, right? And it's hard because not many other Western countries are kind of looking at these issues as strongly as I think we are at the moment.
That's interesting.
In terms of those countries which carry kind of large ethnic minority groups, I think those countries which are really good with women's agenda and women in health kind of agenda tends to be those kind of Nordic kind of Scandinavian countries, which are actually racially and ethnically homogenous. So it's really difficult for us to kind of, follow those examples, because they have a very different makeup and they have very different cultural norms and behaviors and structures. So it's very difficult to kind of look into the international system to find examples. I think this is something which really takes a bottom-up kind of approach, and it's not just government leaders who are important to this. It's local leaders too, and it's communities. We need to take more bottom-up strategies. And whilst it's important for government to conduct, national research, we also need to conduct local research, and we need to look into, I'm sure, for example, I saw a study, Brighton was doing this, they were doing local research, but I'm sure Brighton would be very different to a place like Bradford or another place which carries, a large proportion of immigrant women. So it's important that we drive these services to kind of help those who need it. And it's not going to be the same everywhere. It's going to be different in different places. So we need that national picture to compare it by, but we also need a localized picture too, and we need qualitative data. There's, as you said before, there's issues with the data, but that's because it can't, quantitative data can only capture so much. We need to hear the issues from the women themselves, from those 100,000 responses. We need to know what they're unhappy about. Now that we know they're unhappy, which I've known for a long time, we need to know exactly what it is they want fixed, and how we can do that. So we need to have that qualitative data. We need to have that localized picture, and also it's not just up to the NHS to do it. It's up to other actors within that community too. It's up to the education system. It's up to communities, and other things too, I'm sure. So to tackle these issues, it's not something which can be conducted by policy alone. It's a joint effort.
I think that's really interesting. And what I've kind of heard there is, we know the problem, and you've spent several minutes raising the problem and citing the research, but also, as I said, your kind of personal experience. But we need to know better the why. So trying to really get under the skin of that 100,000 response survey, and to really kind of understand on a lived experience level why that this is being felt. So possibly that could be a next step in the next 5 years to maybe sort of add a bit to it. And one of the other things you said, which was really interesting to me, was the international system. There isn't an example of appropriate best practice that the United Kingdom can take from. I know this is a big, I know the government likes to say this, but maybe this is a genuine opportunity where the UK government could lead the way and really kind of set the standard for what it could look like.
Yeah, I think so too. There's no excuse not to. You know, this is a prominent issue, and you know, we are a country where we, you know, there's a lot of nepotism and there's a lot of inequality, but there's a lot of educated women, and there's a lot of educated women from these Black and Asian communities, and I hope it keeps on increasing. But I think, you know, when given the right tools, we really can make change. And as cliche as it is, you know, if you have the power to, every little makes a difference. Even, and it's not got to be a big difference. It comes from, you know, being able to share those stories and being open to one another. You know, it doesn't need to be change 100%. Not every woman needs to make change in government. It's change. It's the everyday changes and being supportive. And it's not just up to women. It's up to men too. It's a whole population problem.
Of course, no problem. It's absolutely fantastic to be able to speak and talk about that at such length. These things I always say could go on for much longer, and even things coming to the top of my head that I know we've not touched on. So I would like to say I'd hope we'd be able to come back and do this, but I'm sure we will actually. It'll be great to speak at more length about this or about something else, but either way, thank you very much for your time. Always good to speak.
Thank you. Great questions.